I am too.
That is the
This
power.
is very important, timely. Excited about it.
It's sad for us, but
Well,
excited.
and for the whole, yeah, the larger picture. Yeah. We'll get through. We will get through.
So, Jim, do you know this person that's going to speak?
No,
Oh, Nick. You do know.
Gary's an okay guy.
Well, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my experience with Contact Jim Carter.
Oh, good.
I have a friend who was in Peace Corps, and he was in Mali, and Jimmy was somewhere in the area. And the people lined the roads and applauded as they were found. He said it was the most moving experience he'd ever had. Just, they were just then the other thing was, I worked on the very first house in the house. It was my friend Lily Casino, and she has a special mortgage. She
So you got your garden back now?
so many.
Yes and no.
I cleaned windows and
I've got a lot of
stuff.
friends.
It wasn't a real thing, but I thought, oh, this
I have wrestling. Waiting for
really was great. I love that.
that's a good experience.
Open my
I know you said the time to do this when you can.
You know, when I heard you were, you really just came to my mind. I haven't seen her probably 40 years.
I can remember they weren't.
Hey, John, remember getting more calls.
Pruning will go wrong. In fact, the next Hennepin Horse Society. Whole landscape. That's falling. What's your? And Jerry was. That's falling. It's real confusing. They sell it at the rush. Floating ropes.
But you have to get four. Yeah, that's what you want. And then it tells you, great, but it doesn't.
So what they lose
Yeah.
it for tax,
So
they
we gotta get four, and then it gives you another confusing.
I'm really looking forward to dealing with this.
Just have faith, you know. Now you get four when you're done with everything else, and then you'll get another run.
And I don't have some patience on the day.
And I don't even know if you have to do anything with that one, because you.
Don't even do it.
That lets you see what the end is playing for, that you wish, so. It would be
And then you kill them.
That's all we need.
Mrs. Becker.
Especially that
Yeah.
Okay, good morning. Hi, welcome. I'm Bryce Hamilton on the Forum Committee, and it's a delight to welcome our presenter today, Nathan Stock. Nathan and his wife, Kate Tabor, and their two kids are very active members of our Plymouth family, I want to say. Nathan spoke to us last spring at the two-part session here. How many of you were here for that? Hey, Nathan, look, there's a nice turnout then. He spoke then on what was causing some of the causes for the social division and political violence that was beginning to be seen. And what he's talking about today, what can you do about toxic polarization? It's a great title. What we can do to bridge these divides, some ideas. Anyway, Nathan Nathan works for the Carter Center, Jimmy Carter, 100 years old, and has for some time. And in the summer of 2020, he designed a new project to mitigate political and identity-based violence. And that's what he's been working on. And he was just saying briefly that he's really in the midst of it now. This is that fourth year. Lots going on, and you'll want to ask about that because that's pretty important stuff. Nathan has an MA in International Peace and Conflict from American University in DC. And then he also has a BA in International Relations from Colgate University. So, Nathan, we're delighted. It's all yours, and let's welcome Nathan.
Thanks, Bryce. It's great to be with all of you. Folks who are able, I would encourage you to sit up closer to the front, just so everybody can see the screen. So it's great to be back. I'm sorry it's been 6 months since we last talked. I promised you in my session in the spring that I would have good news for you, or better news. I acknowledge that my spring remarks may have been a little depressing. We talked about drivers of polarization. We talked about what I called structural changes in American life, changes in technology, the rise of the internet, social media, changes in the way we communicate, demographic change, immigration, all of these things that created conditions conducive to the divisions we're seeing in American life. We also talked in the spring about emerging brain science, a whole new field that suggests that in many ways human beings are wired for tribal or group-based thinking. And that when you put all these things together, we have a set of conditions that make polarization in this current moment very likely. We also talked then about what are some of the unique factors in American life that are driving this rise in political and identity-based violence. But I promised you that in October, we would talk about what we could do about it, and that is why we are here today. So, first, this is a slide that I showed back in the spring, and I want to show it one more time. My point in the spring was that this this line graph illustrates how our political views correlate with different aspects of our identities. This is the response to a battery of survey questions between 1994 and 2017. And what you can see here is that back in '94, party affiliation was almost the same as one's racial or ethnic background, almost the same as whether one was particularly religious, in predicting responses to 14 questions about, your policy views, whether you're left-leaning or right-leaning. And the point I made in the spring was that in the course of, 15, 20 years, this had changed markedly. The point I want to make today is 1994 wasn't that long ago. I started college in 1994, so help me God, it wasn't that long ago. I want to remind everyone that it wasn't always this way. And I know looking at you, we're of an age, fortunately for us, where we can remember something different. In addition, there are metrics for looking back across the span of American history, including to periods where we have depolarized. So this is a metric produced by some political scientists that looks at the distance between votes in the US House of Representatives and the Senate and ideological makeup. And essentially what you're seeing here from the beginning of the 20th century, into the mid-century, into, circa 1950, 1960, is depolarization. You're seeing people voting across party lines, voting in similar ways, increasingly through, the first half of the 20th century. This isn't a perfect measurement, but it is a proxy for understanding a time period of 70 years, when arguably polarization in American life was going down. That said, as we talked about in the spring, the issues at stake are large and complicated. I'll send these slides around again, or Bryce can send them around. Again, they have footnotes. You don't need to read the footnotes from the back, but if you want to dive deeper into these topics, this book by Columbia University's Peter Coleman is great. And, the point he makes, which is the point I made in the spring, is there's a lot going on here when you really want to unpack how we have become divided and also how we get out of it. That said, I have a three-part framework that I think can help us get our arms around these complicated problems. I call it cousin, community, and country. I think I started with cousin because it alliterates. Also, I was raised Roman Catholic. I have a lot of cousins. But this is just a stand-in for thinking about interpersonal relationships. Could be friends, coworkers, could be members of your family, right? There are a set of interventions that can help us bridge these partisan divides in our personal relationships. Then we'll talk about community. Think of that as group level engagements, groups of people, groups of our fellow Americans, right? Could be in an office setting, in a community setting, in a church setting. And then we'll close by talking a little bit about this phenomenon of polarization as a national level problem and what we might do about it. Again, this is hard. This is from a Pew study in the last few years. As you begin to dive into these interventions, if you decide to go on a journey with that cousin or uncle that you're always getting into fights with at Thanksgiving dinner, just set your expectations, right, for how challenging you may find this. That said, if you want to dive in to those interpersonal relationships, talking to your cousin with whom you may disagree, I strongly suggest starting with steps designed to humanize you and your cousin, okay? There are ways to remind folks that we are more than our political differences. And it's really useful to start there. There's a Rosie and Charlie, who most of you know. This is them on Christmas morning. I heroically assembled that thing out of pipes. You don't have to have kids at a cute life stage to do this, right? You could have a pet, right? You could have a hobby, right? But lift up something. If you pick that one relationship in your life where you really want to dig into these hard issues, start with reminding that other person that, hey, I am also this person. I'm not just a Democrat or a Republican, I'm a dad or a dog lover, right? Then there are a lot of tried and true tactics for how you can communicate effectively in a fraught context. I call these the 5 Ds of constructive listening, and none of this I made up, right? This draws on lots of existing tactics around constructive dialogue and listening, but the ones I like are, don't interrupt, don't call names, do practice active listening. Quick show of hands, is everyone familiar with the term active listening? Right, I figured, okay. Listen to understand. So you're sitting down with your cousin. Maybe you've finished your Thanksgiving turkey. It's time. Remember that a lot of the purpose of this exercise is to better learn where your cousin is coming from. And as you're doing that, be alert to the underlying values that that other person is expressing, right? I'm going to go out on a limb and speculate that this is a left-leaning crowd, like me. Maybe I know some of you. So you're engaging with your conservative cousin, and he is expressing concern about illegal immigration and crime. It is appropriate, perhaps, to reflect back to him, hey, I hear that you're concerned about safety in our community. And perhaps you could say, I'm concerned about that too. You are not agreeing with the thing the person said, but you are deliberately identifying a shared underlying value, even if you disagree about what to do about that. Right? This is a classic and very helpful technique. In one of my previous lives with the Carter Center, I spent hundreds of hours negotiating with officials from Hamas, the Palestinian political party and militant organization. Some of the people I would speak to had sort of middle-of-the-road views in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Others were way out there. Others were anti-Semitic ideologues. And they would say things that I sometimes found quite reprehensible. But in order to find common ground with them, I would listen for something that I could piggyback on. Well, we can agree that the status of civilians in the Gaza Strip is awful, and they need help. And I want to help find something that we can do about that, right? So, imagine you're sitting with your cousin, you have gone through this listening exercise, then it's time to talk, right? There are, again, some tried and true techniques, and I'm not making any of this up, this is stuff I'm sure you're all familiar with, for how to do that effectively. Acknowledge what you've heard as you begin to speak. Find ways to reflect where you might agree, right? To take our immigration example a step further, maybe it's saying, yeah, the situation on the southern border is not good. It's not good, right? And then, and this is a key one, this is super useful. This is something that's used in the field of international negotiation. When it's time for you to do the talking, you might focus first on how you came to your views, right? We're all adults in this room, and we are all products of our experiences. So if you are left-leaning, what are the things that you did or saw, the people you knew, the jobs you had, the education you got, that brought you to a certain worldview as an adult? As you share that, your cousin, after, the pumpkin pie has been served, is not necessarily going to agree with everything you've said, but it's a lot harder to disagree with one's personal experience. And as you tell that story, you can elicit that from your cousin. Well, Mike, all right, you've said X, Y, and Z. Like, what do you think it is in your background that brought you to those views? And again, you don't have to agree. You're not legitimizing what that person said, but everybody's got a story. Everybody's got a backstory for who they are, right? And this can be a really useful tactic for finding some meaningful common ground. Another one, when you are talking about your feelings, when you're talking about the issues du jour, and Lord knows in 2024, we all have hot button things. We all have issues that might get us a little hot under the collar. Warn the other person in advance. Hey, maybe it's crime. You were a victim of a violent crime. It's hard for me to talk about this. It's personal. I had a traumatic experience. signal that before you dive into that topic that is very fraught for you, so that you're prepping the other person and kind of buffering them a little bit if you do get a little hot under the collar. It will help them deal with you. And then, and this is maybe obvious, but don't assume you're going to agree, right? Don't assume you're going to agree even if you've had this constructive exchange. And relatedly, commit to, if I may recommend, the long haul. So if you want to go on this journey, pick somebody in your life where you know you're on different sides of this divide. You don't necessarily have to say this up front, right? You don't have to, rope your cousin Mike into a weekly phone call, but at least have the first one and then open the door to talking again. Because it's going to take more than one conversation around these issues to get anywhere. If possible, compete to repeated interactions and focus on building understanding and trust. Does this make sense? And there's little here that I've made up. I'm just trying to package it in a constructive way. This is based on a lot of tried and true dialogue techniques. All right, so that's a set of tactics you can use in those interpersonal relationships. Now, this whole idea that you can bifurcate this between the interpersonal and the group and the national, that's a little artificial. It's just a useful way of breaking down a complex problem. The interpersonal tactics that we talked about here are going to be useful in your group interactions as well, especially when you're dealing in groups, but it's true to some extent for individual engagements. Think about positive shared group identities. Be intentional about finding things that groups of people who may be divided by politics still have in common. This is a version of the logo of the Pittsburgh Steelers, right? Venerable NFL franchise. This is a meme that went around Pittsburgh and Southwest Pennsylvania after the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, which was the worst act of anti-Semitic violence on U.S. soil. What are people signaling by sharing this graphic on social media? They're saying, hey, this thing that just happened is awful, and just like we're all Steelers fans, this violence that has occurred in our community is beyond the pale. We have this shared identity. We're all from Pittsburgh. We're all Steelers fans. We all stand in solidarity with the victims of these violence, and this thing is not a part of our community. We have these shared values, right? That's an example. That can be your love of the Vikings, right? Or of the Lynx. Or, I'm from the Buffalo, New York area, very, very small town, about an hour from Buffalo. My town is, the population has been declining for 40 years. There's not a lot going on. But you know what? There is one restaurant in town that makes phenomenal chicken wings. I mean phenomenal, right? So okay, if you're in a community that makes good wings, hold on to that. Talk about that. It sounds hokey, but it's not. These kinds of things can help, right? All right, then let's imagine this is in a work setting. You work in an office where, these issues are kind of fraught, right? And there are people in the workspace who lean right and lean left, and it's tense, right? Let's say you want to do something with those two groups. There's a whole body of research around how you set up intergroup contacts, and this goes back, to research going back to at least the 70s between Black and white Americans or people across various lines of different in identity. How do you set up those group engagements for success? Because yes, in theory, when you get two different groups together and they, do a project or a community service activity, or they're in the military, right? Some of this goes back to World War II and different, lines of identity, people who were thrown together in combat units. In the right conditions, yes, familiarity can reduce prejudice and stereotype. In the wrong conditions, it can make it worse, right? It's not simple to pull this off. There's research from the Israeli-Palestinian context of, efforts to get young Israelis and young Palestinians to play soccer. And the good news is, you can get those kids to play soccer together, and in the short term, that has somewhat of a humanizing effect, and they maybe reduces prejudice a little bit. But then, as they did some longitudinal research on this, and what are the long-term impacts, the long-term impacts are pretty much nil, because those Palestinian kids, still live in a refugee camp. They still need to go back through Israeli army checkpoints to get home, where their parents are humiliated or who knows what. And so the point is, you have to set up intergroup engagements for success. And there are ways to do that. So you may not be able to read all of this, that's fine. But if you want to dig into this, there's an academic paper cited on the slide. The point is, there are a few common things that you can do to make this work better. Equal status. Set yourself up for success, folks. Like, try to think of it as accounting for other variables. So if you have a group or two groups, one that's left-leaning and one that's right-leaning, if there are also significant differences of class or social status, wealth and poverty, that's just going to make this harder, right? So, if you want to engage in some sort of, political dialogue over time, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say this is a left-leaning, relatively middle-class, educated group. We'll start with, go pick a suburban congregation of fellow white Twin Cities folks who are, also, relatively middle-class and educated. So you've accounted for those other things. You are of otherwise equal social status, right? Then find ways to set yourself up for cooperation, maybe to pursue common goals, right? And this kind of gets to this next slide. You don't have to dive right into the hard stuff. Maybe you pick a project that you do, right? One of the initiatives that I have been supporting in my day job with the Carter Center, we got a small grant from the Department of Homeland Security to organize sort of small-scale community projects. We had a methodology where we'd bring 20 or 30 people into a room in North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, and we walked them through a kind of community problem-solving process where they would identify local sources of tension, and then they would sort of brainstorm together and vote on a micro project. Something you could do for a couple of months, 2-3 months. You could get a $2,000 grant if you needed to buy pizza or hire a dialogue coach, right? And what these community experiments demonstrated was that, yes, we're all in this polarized environment. There are all kinds of identity fault lines. But sometimes it's useful to get people together to have picnics across generational lines. That was one of the projects we supported in North Carolina, right? There was another group that did dinners in Arizona, right? And created space for people to get together. And they curated the groups so that they were, politically heterogeneous, left-leaning and right-leaning, right? So do a shared project. That Peter Coleman book I said it a minute ago, he cites research that suggests that two people walking together find it easier to reach common ground. Something about our biology, movement, apparently it helps, right? Have fun. I don't know. Get your kids together and everybody go to an amusement park. You don't have to start with the most contentious issues in our society. You can build some degree of trust and understanding that then might set you up to engage on the stuff that's harder, right? Also, wherever possible, leverage existing cross-partisan institutions, right? That's a fancy term for if you have a bunch of coworkers and you're in an office setting and you have these political differences among that community of people in the office, well, you have something there, right? You all work for so-and-so, right? Rotary clubs, there are faith institutions, there are civic institutions that do still bring people together across the partisan divide. So work through those institutions where you can. And then, find people that still hold credibility across these divides. And these people are there, right? Work with those people. And relatedly, as you're identifying people who are listened to across these divides, think about how you can be alert to opportunities to strengthen better norms of behavior, right? This, to me, is key. It's key to a lot of my day job with the Carter Center. We have seen in our country, 2016, and we talked about this some in the spring, the norms of acceptable behavior have changed. And right? We've had certain political figures in the media that have created a permission structure for what I consider to be bad behavior, and what most Americans across political lines consider to be bad behavior. Name calling, demonizing your fellow Americans. Be alert to opportunities to constantly set and reinforce expectations for how we should treat each other and what we should expect from our leaders. And leaders is defined broadly here. Anybody with a platform. Could be a local platform, could be a national platform. This is really important. And then look for ways to move groups of opinion leaders. I don't think I mentioned this last time, but some of the initial social science research that set me on the journey that eventually became my current day job was digging into where do our beliefs about right and wrong come from? How do groups of people, how do communities decide, well, X behavior is acceptable and Y is unacceptable? I found work by an Italian academic at the University of Pennsylvania, Cristina Bicchieri, who's cited here. She writes some very dense stuff about game theory. There's a lot of math. I skimmed over those parts. But in this book, she applies her research on norm formation to female genital mutilation. She was working with the United Nations in parts of Eastern Africa to develop behavioral health interventions to wipe out this practice, to get people in a given village where they've done this forever to stop doing it. And to boil down her complicated research, what she found was that if you can convince all of the elders, the old guys in a given village, together that this thing we've been doing to girls in our community is bad, and you get them to come out as a group, this is key, not one at a time, as a block, and say, hey, you know what? We've changed our mind. Let's stop doing female genital mutilation. You can change norms. This thing that was acceptable can now become unacceptable. Keep this in mind all the time. This is what I do for my day job now. It is trying to figure out how to lift up groups of people who can be credible messengers from the right and the left to bolster basic norms of better behavior. If you lose an election, you can go to court. This is America. We love lawyers, right? It's all part of the American way. You can do that. If you lose an election and you lose in court, then you got to shake hands with the other person and acknowledge that you lost. You can't demonize groups of your fellow Americans based on their identity, and you definitely can't incite violence, right? And believe me, the survey data on this is very clear. The large majority of Americans still agree with the three things I just said. Remember that in this election cycle. We are the majority, and that includes lots of Republicans too, right? What has happened in our country in many ways is an angry minority that has seized the microphone. So be looking for ways to move groups of people, including people that for this crowd may be unlikely allies. You're not going to agree on the war in Gaza, you're not going to agree on abortion, but you do still agree on some fundamentals that are critical to upholding our democracy, right? And this gets to a larger point about how we get out of this as a country, but we need a big tent coalition to hold on to our democracy. That's the framing here. You got to have a lot of people who might be uncomfortable in some ways, but you agree on some basics around the democracy itself, and with that, we can get through this. So anyway, look for groups of people that can be mobilized around these broad values. One example of this is something else being supported by the Carter Center right now, these things we call the Principles for Trusted Elections. You can just Google these. You can sign up as a citizen. You can lend your voice to these principles. But again, this is an effort to say that across the aisle, most people, we've survey tested these, right? Most Americans, right-leaning, left-leaning, agree that you should have nonviolent campaigns and that there should be oversight of the process and secure voting, right? Like, this is mom and apple pie, and most Americans are still here. So, look for opportunities to lift up and support these broad shared values. And then, this is a little dark, but keep in mind that out of crisis comes opportunity, right? So this election is part of that, right? The vitriol, the rhetoric, right? Like, this is a moment, as challenging as this is, to keep reminding everybody of all the things we do agree on, right? And you will see this in the media. Part of my day job now, trying to get hundreds of people to repost things on social media that remind folks that, yeah, people are still being kind to each other, right? It's really important to emphasize these values because doing so reduces fear. And fear is the thing that can justify violence, right? Why is violence acceptable? Well, it's acceptable if you think the other guy's going to get you first. And there is a significant, partisan perception gap, right? The median Democrat in this country thinks the median Republican is more anti-democratic than they actually are, and vice versa. So it is really important to find opportunities to lift up these values, but also be alert to opportunities to reset those norms. So we've seen communities in our country. There was an incident in Michigan 2 weeks ago, anti-Semitic flyers plastered around a bunch of communities. Okay, that's a time to organize. Organize Republicans, organize Democrats, hold a candlelight vigil, remind everybody, nope, in our community, this is totally unacceptable. Now, did some people do this anti-Semitic thing? Yeah, but this is a public communication question. Think of this as broad mass political communication. You always want to be looking for opportunities to say, no. It's beyond the pale. It's beyond the pale. We all in this town uphold up these values. In this case, we reject anti-Semitism. Look for these opportunities locally. Okay, last piece of this I want to talk about, then we'll have a little bit of time for discussion, is how we think about this as a national phenomenon. So it's a while since we talked in the spring, but I closed my presentation in the spring with an analysis of the unique ways in which American democracy is conducive to polarization and is unstable and even prone to violence. We have a filibuster in the Senate, right? We have an electoral college, we have gerrymandering, we have all these quirks that just make it harder to pass legislation and in some cases facilitate aspects of kinds of minority rule. So, if having this awkward conversation with your cousin at Thanksgiving dinner is not your jam, that's fine. Hit the link on that slide for Common Cause Minnesota and work on gerrymandering. Or sign up for American Promise and work on campaign finance reform. Reforming our system. These are all links to organizations that you can learn more about. Trying to pass a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. These are things that will also help these problems, right? Reforming the system so that the democracy works better and delivers for more people allows us to get to, the 65% of Americans who want a certain amount of gun reform. But we can't get that because of the weird quirks in the system. That will help also. It will help with all the other problems we've been talking about. The other thing is race. So this is, in part, just a clone of the slide I shared earlier, showing, in this case, votes in the House of Representatives and the way those votes varied along ideological lines, as a metric for polarization having gone down in the early 20th century. That's still here. That's the blue line with the triangles. The red dots are the percentage of the population that's foreign-born. And this, in this case, goes to 1999. It's not perfect data. It's not a perfect metric. But it's telling you something. Remember what I said last time about demographic change being probably the single biggest driver of polarization, not just in our democracy, very much in Europe as well. The point here is there's a relationship between the perception of how white the country is or not white and polarization, and in some ways challenges to the democracy itself. So, if you want to work on the polarization problem, another way to think about this is from a racial equity lens. Work on racial equity, which is something I know this congregation is already doing, right? The point I want to make is these things are connected. I don't know if you need these resources, but I mean, the best case way to think about this from a best practices perspective is through national action, is a government-backed, set of commissions that not only would, talk about things like reparations, but would go through some kind of national truth-telling or transitional justice process to move this forward. Now, that legislation is probably not, getting out of committee anytime soon, but this is an example. The House has a bill on this, and there's a Senate bill to at least look at some of this. But even if we're not going to have a South Africa-style Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there are other resources for doing this at the local level. So the Kellogg Foundation, the Equal Justice Initiative, you can go onto their websites, you may already know this, but they have tools for how communities can talk through their histories of racial violence in a constructive way. Last thing I want to say, there are a number of sort of tried and true techniques for helping you when you're in those hard conversations, in groups or with your cousin or whomever, to keep it moving forward, right? So you're talking with your cousin Mike, you're getting pissed, he's getting pissed. Pause and reflect, okay? What I mean is, stop yourself, stop talking, take a deep breath, remind yourself why you're doing this. All right, I'm not gonna get drawn into an argument. I'm here to understand better what my cousin thinks and believes. Return to the big picture. All right, Mike, yeah, we're both irritated about this, but I wanted to better understand where you're coming from. And I hope you can understand where I'm coming from. Let's say you move through this process with your cousin over a period of weeks and months. You could try an experiment where you write the other person's story. This is another one that's used in international mediation sometimes. Test yourself. See if you could write, after a few months, how your cousin Mike came to his views and have him do it for you, and then switch papers and see how you did. Classic, this is cited in the footnote here, separate interest from positions. This goes back to the work of Bill Fisher, William Ury at Harvard. What people say is not always the same as what they need. Doesn't mean they're lying. It just means we all get stuck in the things we think we want, and that's distinct from the underlying need. So you want to be listening for, what does this person need? The classic example here is the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, where Israel needed control over its territory, and so the Israelis pulled out. And the Israelis needed security, and so they stationed international observers in the Sinai Peninsula so that Israel could never be invaded again from the Sinai, right? So, separate interest from positions. Think about, if you're going on this journey with your cousin over the long term, through sort of longer periods of negotiation, how do you get to the kinds of compromises that both sides can sell, right? Like how would you write a story together with that cousin where you kind of come to a shared narrative where this is how I get mine. Like I can show that I'm holding on to my values while maybe coming a step or two in your direction and vice versa. And then last but not least, have grace for yourself and for your cousin and your coworkers and whomever else, right? This stuff is super hard. Don't beat yourself up when this is challenging. I think we have just a few minutes for questions. Anybody want to jump in?
I have a mic for anybody who wants to ask.
Oh, I'll send them to Bryce, and Bryce can send them around, slides.
And of course, this is all, it's being recorded now, so
Oh.
you can pick it up online also. So questions,
We can get them too.
I have one just right off the bat. Would you just say a few words about what's current year 4 of this new project of yours in the 6 states? Just overall, this getting together of people. Just briefly a comment on that.
Yeah, so my day job is working in Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. And in those 6 states, we've currently recruited 2,700 Americans as members of these bipartisan civic networks that we've set up in each state. I hired former, quite senior Republicans and Democrats, usually a pair in each state, to run these networks to recruit their fellow Arizonans or Wisconsinites. And then they've been doing a lot of election education. So taking, county clerks around northern Michigan and, getting in the local papers and on local radio to describe what happens when you cast your ballot, to get ahead of election-related misinformation. Increasingly also just messaging, getting into local media, lifting up stories of how, folks in Arizona aren't as scary to their fellow Americans as they might seem, pushing out this election education messaging, and then finally, what we're up to my eyeballs in right now, is helping the networks plan to rapidly respond to election misinformation, threats, or violence over the next 3 months. So I just did these sort of planning workshops with Arizona and Michigan last week, where we bring, 20, 30 of the network members together. We say, okay, if we need to call the county sheriff in Maricopa County, Arizona, who's the best person to do that? Who has inroads to Native communities in the southwest of the state? How do we engage with potential victims of violence over the next few months? How do we ensure that, the next time a Republican county commissioner is getting death threats for certifying election results, we can organize a bipartisan response in the media saying, no. Most Arizonans don't support that, right? So I'm trying to build the kind of bipartisan infrastructure that we didn't have in 2020, frankly. I don't know how successful we'll be, but that's my day job.
Other questions?
So I was listening to the radio the other day, and so I wasn't in conversation with the cousin I'm going to make reference to, but I want to pretend that I was, right? So if someone sitting across from me had said what this man said, so it was a piece about black male voters who were voting for a certain male candidate who was running for president. And he said something like, so there's a lot of conversation about this person being a toxic masculine person, but I think of him just as a masculine person. He's a lot like my dad, tells it like it is, tough guy. And so here's my question is, if I'd sitting across from this guy, my brain would do that thing my brain does, which is come to conclusions in a moment like that. So I think, so his dad was a violent guy and he needs that to be okay, so he's gonna vote for the violent guy. Okay, how do I stay out of conclusions? Because if I'm sitting across from my cousin who says that, this conclusion is not going to be a bump in the road. It's going to throw me into the ditch with my broken neck. I'm not going to go anywhere from there with this guy, right? How do I not do that part? Or recover from that part, right? Because I'm not the only one who's going to do that, right? There's some version of it.
Yeah, well, perhaps if you're in the right setting, you can ask questions. Well, tell me more about that. In what ways is Donald Trump like your dad? And then that would lead me to a question, something like, what do you think you learned from your dad? What was positive and negative about that for you? How does it shape you today? You may have to put your anthropologist hat on, suspend judgment and just focus on learning. And over time, that may give you inroads for gently pushing for change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the problem is we weren't at the table.
Right.
I couldn't do anything but that.
Right. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Hey, Carrie.
Along those lines, I think there's a real challenge with social media. So it's the same thing, kind of what you're saying about not being face to face. We have a number of people I've had to unfriend, frankly, because they're just so extreme. And one little conversation piece, even a question, becomes something so big, and it almost gives them fuel, if that makes sense. So that's probably my biggest challenge, is how do you navigate those questions, those probing things, that opportunity to connect our similarities and our humanity by doing it over the social media. It's a real, I think it's a real challenge.
Yeah. So I will share something that some of my team members do, like state leaders who are running these operations. They will engage with their own side. So a woman named Jennifer, former Democratic state legislator from Florida, she helps lead my Florida network. And, after the 22 elections, Democrats in Florida did not do well. And she saw people she knew, prominent local Democrats, these are school board heads, local elected officials, posting things on social media that weren't accurate, that were calling into question the accuracy of the election result in Florida when their side had lost, without real evidence. She would call them on the phone. So I would say step one, if you can, depends on the relationship, right? Don't respond on social media. Don't respond on social media where possible. If we're all of an age where we remember when telephones just rang, right? We can call people on the phone. We're not Gen Z. But it really does help. And my colleague Jennifer, repeatedly, she convinced folks to take Facebook posts down that were, essentially disinformation about elections, right? And I have conservatives on my team who've done similar things with their side. So I don't have an easy answer to this, and I know that not every relationship is conducive to that, but where possible, make that human connection. I think you will find, as soon as you actually talk to somebody, that the temperature goes down at least a few degrees, and maybe that gives you an opening.
Well, time for us to break, but let's give Nathan a hand.
Thanks, guys. Thanks very much.
It's just marvelous work what you're doing for your day job. It's awesome. Alert to all of you, once a year we tend to have a forum session that we converse with our ministers, and that is going to be next Sunday at 10. Apparently there's going to be a 12 o'clock session also, because so much is going on, but they're going to be here and question-answer conversation about a lot of things that are happening now within our church. So please be present with us next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep.